Well, welcome everyone to Views from the Capitol. This is our State of the State edition. For those of you that watched the speech, you know it was short, which is always nice, with no standing and sitting and introducing people and clapping. It made for a quite short speech. So there are benefits to being fully remote. So I am Jennifer Smith, the Director of Government Relations for MASB. With me are the rest of the Government Relations team, Jeff Cobb, our Assistant Director, and DeShandria Bedingfield, our Grassroots and Policy Analyst. DeShandria will be helping you out with any links we need in the chat or questions you have that are technical in nature. And Jeff is going to be my co-presenter for today. We're going to keep everyone muted to cut down on the background noise. It makes it easier for us to present. There is a chat function, and any questions that you have, please put into the chat. We will go through those as we go through our presentation. We're going to divide it into two. We're going to cover the State of the State address first, and we'll stop and take questions about State of the State. And then we'll cover the new legislature, what's going on there, MASB priorities, those sorts of things in the second half. So as I said, any questions, just put those in the chat. We are recording this, so we'll make this available sometime next week. It won't be available yet today, but it will be available next week if any of your colleagues missed it and would like to view it later. One thing, since this is our first Views from the Capitol for the year, if you are not receiving News from the Capitol, which will come out later this afternoon, so you can watch that in your inbox. If you find that you don't receive it, please let us know. We'll double check, make sure that your email is correct in our system. We just did a big data upload. We want to make sure that it's correct. Or we may have missed you as we did the data upload. And then if you're a new board member, you got put in our system. So we want to make sure that everyone's receiving that. So if you don't get that this afternoon, reach out to one of the three of us or just generically at masb.gov at masb.org. And we will make sure we get that fixed for you. That system, as most of you know, is what we send weekly updates about what the legislature is up to. And if we have any legislative alerts, they go through that system as well. So we just want to make sure that all of you are there. So with that, we will roll into the governor's speech. And she used the phrase that you always hear in the State of the Union, but not always in the State of the State. The State of the State is, and she used the word resilient. And she spent a lot of the time in the beginning of this speech talking about what we've done over the last mostly 10 months since our first COVID case appeared in March of 2020. She talked about some of the decisions that had to be made, some of the hard decisions that were made, how we were able to flatten the curve because Michiganders heeded the advice that was coming from DHHS, from the CDC, from the government. She had a moment where she talked about that we've lost over 14,000 Michiganders to COVID. And she took a moment just to acknowledge those, and she named a couple of the ones that were close to her. So the beginning of the speech was sort of a somber beginning about what she's done in COVID. But then she talked about some of the bipartisan things that they got done with the budget that they passed and with some of the other things that they were able to do over the last year, especially in those last few months, to be able to continue some of the benefits to our people in our state, to be able to get the money out to school districts, to be able to get a budget balanced twice because they had to rebalance the year before and balance last year's. So she pointed to those sorts of things too. And then she had 5 themes that she talked about, and that's what we'll cover in a little bit more detail. She mentioned healthcare, economy and jobs, education, roads, and water. And I'm going to turn to Jeff to cover a couple of those first.
Yeah, so as you might expect, healthcare was sort of the top of the agenda because of the pandemic. And she highlighted a couple things. First, she talked about her task force to reduce racial disparities and how effective that has been in terms of eliminating those disparities when it comes to the pandemic. She talked about her newest commission to promote vaccinations, and she just made the appointments, and there'll be more about that in the News from the Capitol. But it's a commission that basically is going to kind of raise awareness of to take the vaccine and try to help persuade those folks that maybe are a little hesitant to take it. She called for a $2 an hour increase in wages for frontline workers. And she also kind of highlighted that even though the vaccine has been a little bit slow to roll out, that we still have vaccinated, I think we're number 6 in the country in terms of vaccinations. And so she took credit for that. She did mention that there's a prescription drug task force that she is working with in the legislature to lower prescription drug prices and provide more transparency. So that was kind of the theme of the healthcare portion. We'll see if those proposals get any kind of traction in the legislature or not. And then moving forward, she did talk about the economy a little bit as well. And her focus here was extending the unemployment benefits from 20 to 26 weeks. There seems to be support in the legislature for that. I think the issue will be in terms of how to pay for that expansion, whether or not it should be used from increasing the amount that businesses put into the unemployment fund or paying it out of the general fund. And so I think that will be the big issue that will be debated. And she also called on extending the good jobs legislation. This was a creation from the Snyder administration that provides tax incentives for companies to locate or expand in Michigan, create jobs here. And she did mention that Pfizer was one of the benefits of that that program, and the good things that Pfizer's done, obviously, with the vaccine rollout. And so she asked for a continuation of that program. So that was kind of and then she also talked about her her supplemental that she announced maybe a week or two ago that would spend more money on small business relief, specifically for restaurants and folks that have been really impacted by the pandemic. And then she also talked about the need for more funding to distribute more vaccines. So that was kind of her focus on the economy. Jen?
So then she turned, sort of as a transition, she talked about that My COVID Recovery Plan is what she's calling it, that Jeff just referred to with the relief for small businesses. It also includes the nearly $2 billion we're receiving from the federal government for education. And so in her plan that she released a week or so ago, it would distribute the 1.6 billion that we're receiving from ESSER funds, which is the Education Relief Fund. And through those funds, there would be 90% would be distributed by federal formula through Title 1A. And then the remaining 10% would be determined by the state. And so from her plan, she put together 50% of the money would be a per pupil that would go to students or to schools based on their special education FTEs, and 50% would go out to districts based on a flat per pupil. So this would ensure that every district across the state receives money to deal with the pandemic relief. She added $300 million worth of school aid fund to that to boost up the amount of money that would be available to districts, topping us out at about $457 million that the state would distribute through that 50-50 formula. $10 million is set aside for ISDs specifically. The other 1.6, as I said, goes out through the Title 1A. So this is the formula that she put out a couple weeks ago. We have not seen necessarily a good reaction on that yet, but she brought that up and urged the legislature again to pass her COVID recovery plan. And that education piece is just part of it. The rest of the recovery plan covers the rest of the federal money that's flowing to the state, as well as some of that assistance that Jeff mentioned under the economy. Also with education, she talked about that a lot of her proposals for education are going to come out in the budget, which will happen the second week of February. And so I think we'll see a lot more details about education then. There wasn't a lot of details in this speech. She did mention that she's reconvening the Return to School Advisory Council and tasking them with coming up with best practices to, for kids going forward and for districts going forward. So to get learning recovery and mental health and physical health supports and those sorts of things She's calling on that task force to come back together, and it's going to work quickly. She's asking for things back from them, I believe, by the end of March. So some of that may tie into the budget as it moves forward as well. She also talked about the My Classroom Heroes, which was the hazard pay, is what we were calling it before. The money that was going out to teachers and staff that worked during the pandemic as an extra bonus. And that money is supposed to be released to the staff that qualified and that were turned in by their districts next month. She moved on from there into her Futures for Frontliners, which is both education and jobs. So this is a free community college for frontline workers, a lot of the medical workers, so that they could go back to community college, finish a degree. So it's for those that don't have a degree yet, but are working on the front lines, that have been exposed and that have put their safety aside to help others. So she created that Future for Frontliners program, and that will continue. She also talked about paths to get Michigan back to work, to grow the economy, get Michigan back on their feet, and to get open. But she kept, one of the themes to the whole thing is that we can't open if we're not healthy, and that we need healthy people to have a healthy economy. So part of her jobs focused on that as well. And the Michigan Back to Work program to get people back on their feet and back in those various sectors that have been suffering.
And then she also, there was two other themes of the night. One focused on roads. As you'll recall, that was one of the things that she, focused on when she first ran for governor. And she touted her Rebuilding Michigan bonding plan, which is basically borrowing money to fix state road projects. But she also asked the legislature to look at providing local communities with more options to fix local roads and bridges. And she is calling on them to move that kind of legislation. And then in terms of clean water, I believe it's last October, she released her My Clean Water initiative. And what this would do is it would raise about $500 million to rebuild water infrastructure across the states, replace systems that are failing in certain communities. And it would do that by basically taking some federal money, borrowing some money, and then a one-time expenditure from the general fund, I believe of about $100 million. And so she was calling on the legislature to implement her clean water initiative. So, that was kind of the main focus. Those were the main areas that she spent discussing. And we'd be happy to answer any questions about the governor's speech.
Any questions about the state of the state? All right, well, let's talk about what the legislature's been up to. They were all sworn in. The brand new session started January 13th. Then due to the threats to the Capitol that you saw nationwide and at our US Capitol, the legislature was shut down. The Capitol was shut down completely for a week after that. So they're just getting back in and getting back at it. Committees have been named, committee meetings have started, and we'll turn to Jeff first to talk about those committees and who we're talking about for chairmanships.
So in the Senate, the committees basically will stay the same as last term. Chairing the Senate Appropriations Committee is still Senator Stamas, and the minority vice chair is Senator Hertel. Education is still going to be chaired by Senator Tice, and the vice chair is Senator Paul Hankey. And then the K-12 budget, it will still be chaired by Senator Schmidt out of Traverse City, and the vice chair, the minority vice chair is Senator Baer. In the House, they made their announcements. The new chair of the Appropriations Committee is Senator Albert, and the minority vice chair is Senator Tate. For the House Education Committee, it's the same as last year. Senator Hornberger will remain as chair with Representative Hornberger, with Representative Camilleri as minority vice chair. And Representative Hornberger is a former school board member, so that's a plus for us. And we have a good relationship with her, and so we'll continue working with her. The K-12 budget will be now chaired by Representative Paquette, and the minority vice chair will be Representative Weiss, who is actually a freshman. So, but she is a former teacher from Detroit Public Schools, so she should be familiar with K-12 budget issues. If you'll recall, last year or last session, there was a two-step process in the House. They had what they called a House Ways and Means Committee. So all the bills had to go through that second committee to reach the House floor. It looks like they're not going to be doing that this year. There is a new committee called Rules and Competitiveness that is going to be chaired by Representative Lilly. But we're not sure that they will have the same kind of function as the Ways and Means. So it will probably be a little bit easier for us to get things out of House Ed or, to get right straight to the floor, things that we're working on. Also in the House, the Tax Policy Committee was named. And this is a big committee for us because we deal with a lot of tax issues. Representative Hall is the chair of that committee. And then Representative Yancey is the minority vice chair. Representative Yancey is also a former school board member, so that is a good plus for us. And then there's one other new committee that the House has created. It's called the Workforce, Trades, and Talent Committee. It's chaired by Representative Griffin and minority vice chair Sabo. This committee, we think, might take up a lot of the career and tech policy discussions. And so we will be keeping an eye on that, and we'll sort of see what they plan to do out of that committee. So with that, I'd be happy to take any questions on committees or structures or anything like that. Okay, great, thanks.
So we talked about the My COVID relief plan and how the governor proposed to spend the close to $2 billion we're receiving from the federal government. You may have seen the day of the State of the State, I see someone put it in the chat, that the Republicans in the House and I believe in the Senate have said that they will not release the school aid money unless the governor signs a bill which would say that DHHS and the governor can have no say over school closures or sports or anything like related to education. We were really disappointed to see that because what they're aiming at is something that they passed at the end of last year. And of course the governor vetoed it, that only allowed DHH epidemic orders to stay in effect for 28 days. And then the legislature would have to decide what those orders look like. And we have seen, unfortunately, that even when the legislature has asked for that power, they haven't used it. There were bills introduced at the end of last session that they never even brought up for a hearing dealing with COVID relief. So it was upsetting to see them tie $2 billion worth of education funding to the idea that the governor can only have, and the Department of Health and Human Services can only have 28 days to deal with a pandemic. But also feels a little disingenuous because they have had the opportunity to move some of these bills and they haven't. So that's what we're dealing with now. They have taken that idea of the 28-day order and they have divided it into two sort of ideas. So they have the general fund money that's coming from the federal government, those things that will deal with vaccine rollouts and unemployment benefits and job support, those sorts of things. That is tied to the 28-day idea. Then they split off the education money into their school aid supplemental and tied it to a bill that specifically says the Department of Human Services and the governor would be restricted from closing a school or non-public school to in-person instruction or prohibiting a qualified sporting event during an epidemic. And it would allow a local health officer to close a public school or a non-public school if certain criteria are met. And so we're in a spot now where the budget that they've actually put forward includes $1.8 billion in federal money and $363 million in school aid money. It allocates all of the federal money through the Title 1A grants, through the amount of money that goes to the non-public schools, and then to the MDE receives an administrative grant to put all of this through. It sends all of that out. It puts the remaining money, the $157 million, into a formula. Basically, it would be distributed for summer programs for K-8, high school credit recovery, and before and after school programs, and schools will receive a certain amount per pupil. Then they add that $363 million back in, but in order to receive any part of that $363 million, you have to offer in-person instruction to all students by February 15th and continue that through the end of the year. So they put some pretty tight strings on that $363 million, which could come out to $250 per pupil for every pupil that you have in-person instruction. So we have concerns with those strings, but the tie bar is the biggest problem. The other thing that this includes are summer school vouchers, which we're not even sure how they would logistically would do it, but it's $250 per eligible child to a parent to attend educational enrichment programs during the summer. And then it also does $21 million of gear funds, which is the money that is appropriated to the governor to spend as she sees fit. And those gear funds would be for eligible summer school or credit recovery program teachers would receive $1,000, and all other eligible school staff would receive $250. So the proposal that they have put together is not all terrible, except for that tie bar and the strings that they've attached to some of the money. This has already had a hearing in House Approps. It popped up the day it was introduced, I believe. We expect another hearing this week. While we fully support giving our money out, we can't support something that is tied to the idea that DHHS can have no control over things to deal with the pandemic. We know that there are varying opinions out there about whether we should be face-to-face or not, but we also know that the circumstances in every single district are different. And we want to be able to have that flexibility for districts to decide, which is why we don't want them forced back face-to-face February 1st. But we also want the ability for decisions to be made at the state level to affect this epidemic. We're never going to be able to end the pandemic if we're not doing it on a statewide level. So we have a lot of issues with those couple of things in there. You've heard a lot too about working together. And the governor's speech, she talked about being bipartisan. I've now seen releases today. They're like, well, show us what bipartisan means. And for how long I've worked in the system, it's frustrating to me because I would rather see both sides say, let's try this bipartisan thing, and then we'll argue about what bipartisan means, but not have one side just be like, you got to show us, because we haven't seen it. And it's just really the rhetoric is getting worse, and that's really concerning as we go forward. So we're going to keep an eye on this funds. We did send a letter to all of legislative leadership in the House and the Senate, asking them to release the money as quickly as possible and with as few strings as possible, because districts can't plan for the summer if they don't know how much funding they're going to have. So this is a fight that's going to continue. We would rather see it happen and be done with before the governor's budget is proposed or is released, but I don't know if that's going to happen. So stay tuned, and we will keep watching that for you as well. And I'm sure there will be no loss of news articles that you can find. So as you read through those, if you have questions, please let us know, because sometimes it's confusing, or it seems very black and white, and it's not when it gets in front of us. So if you ever have questions that you find in the newspapers or in any media reports or just things you hear through the grapevine, please let us know. Are there questions on that? Oh, the legislature has been doing is they held a hearing Both the House and the Senate held hearings in committees on sports yesterday. And they brought in parents and students to testify about the loss of contact sports. A resolution was passed in the Senate to urge the governor and DHHS to open up contact sports now. Some of our counterparts are meeting with DHHS to find out what is their plan. What are they working with? What numbers are they looking at? Like, just educate us on how you're making that decision. They're having that conversation this afternoon. So that's going to be a big thing that lays out there too. The legislature, especially the Republican leadership, really wants sports to open, and they want them open today. And as you've seen in the various announcements, DHHS and the governor are not, they're not willing to go there yet. They're not willing to do contact sports. They're allowing contact sports to practice without touching. So really conditioning drills and things like that. But they're just not at a spot where they're going to allow that to happen. So hopefully we'll have more information this afternoon as far as what DHHS is thinking on the sports side. But those are really the only two issues the legislature has dealt with dealing with schools. I'm going to take a second and scroll back through the questions and see if there are any others.
I saw, I got a message in the chat box asking about the possibility for in-person board meetings. At this point, board meetings are still supposed to be virtual per the DHHS orders. We continue to work with the governor and the department. We are encouraging them to create some flexibility to allow school board meetings to be in person. In fact, we're working on a model resolution that school boards can adopt to send to the department, encouraging them to make that change. So, but yes, under the current guidance right now, I still have to meet virtually.
And there's some questions about the nuance of this fight that we're seeing over the money. And I appreciate the information, Tim, that you put out from Representative, I think it's Damus. I'm not sure how to say his name yet, haven't met him yet. And they are right that they are saying that they're withholding from her plan. But the problem is that the only way they will distribute the money, no matter how they want to do it, is if she signs this bill limiting the power of DHHS. So it is a political struggle, and our kids are in the middle. And that's part of the reason that we started with a nice letter. Somebody asked me to restate that. So we started with a nice letter that went to all of legislative leadership. And it asks for the Title I money to be released immediately as soon as we receive it, which should be, they kept saying by the end of this month, so it should be any day now. So we would like the Title I money released immediately because the legislature cannot control how that is distributed. It must be done through the federal formula. The remaining 10%, we have asked them to distribute as quickly as possible with as few restrictions as possible so that districts can use it as they see fit and start to plan for recovery programs and summer school and those things that most districts are aware their students may need. We will try to get a link to that letter up in News from the Capitol when it goes out today so you can see it. But it really is just an ask of do this quickly and do it now and easily. And with us on it is that MASA, MASB, MASSP, and MAISA are all on that letter together. The tie bar for in-person instruction, that just says that you have to offer in-person instruction and you would receive $250 per pupil that is participating 100% in in-person instruction. 100% in-person instruction can be however you deem it, as long as it's not a hybrid where the student is virtual one day and in person the next, or virtual part of the day and in person the next. That would be a hybrid and not fully in person. I know some districts, to cut down on the number of kids in school, they've been dividing it. They're still considered 100% in person because there is no online instruction, but the kids aren't going full days. They're going half days. So you have part of the population, part of the day, and part of the population the rest of the day. But anything that is fully in person would count as in-person instruction. The open requirement that the legislature is proposing to allow districts to close temporarily when there are outbreaks, that's not clear, but the way it is stated in what I have read so far is that you would have to be in person from February 15th through the end of the year. So I do worry that if you have an outbreak and you shut down, that you lose some of that funding. And that's one of the things that as we go forward, we're going to have to figure out. But as it reads right now, if you had to close temporarily, you would not get the funding because you were not open from February 15th to the end of the year. And that's part of why that language is so troubling, is it doesn't allow for the local decision that it's safer to not be in school. It also doesn't allow for those districts, which I'm sure some of you have faced, when you've got teachers in quarantine and you don't have enough people to staff your school. They have their blinders on. They want the kids in the classroom and they want them there now and they want them to stay there, but they're not considering the other pieces that go with education that we need to have in place and that local control. Confirming that board meetings must be virtual. Yes, as Jeff said, they must be. According to the epidemic order, which is in place until February 21st, indoor gatherings, non-residential indoor gatherings, can only be 10 people and 2 households, same as residential indoor gatherings. There are a limited amount of restrictions. I think there are 12 now, exceptions, not restrictions. I think there are 12 exceptions to that indoor gathering rule. However, school board meetings are not one of them. So they are not allowed to be face-to-face at this point. We didn't put out one with this last epidemic order because it didn't change anything for schools. But every time the epidemic order comes out, we have been including language from Brad Banasic, our legal counsel, about how to do those meetings and that they are required to be virtual. As Jeff mentioned, we have reached out to DHHS and asked them to consider to allow them because we know there are boards that would like to meet face-to-face, especially as you're having your staff go back face-to-face. We received a response from the new director of DHHS saying that she appreciated hearing from us. She'd been on the job for a day and she would include it in the meetings she was having going forward, but we haven't heard anything since then. If we are going 5 days a week and a choice to attend virtually or face-to-face, will that allow fund assistance? It will allow the assistance, but you will only get paid per student that is utilizing face-to-face. And there's a lot of these things that we don't know yet. The bills were just dropped and just heard this week. So we're still working through the details on them as well. Are there any other questions about what the legislature is up to these days? The class size requirements do not apply to schools. That is one of the exceptions to indoor gatherings are classrooms. So you can do a face-to-face fully. As I mentioned, some districts are splitting their population in half and doing half days. They're using bigger spaces. They're spacing desks. Whatever your district needs to do is fine. But the requirements for gathering sizes do not apply to classroom settings. If the governor vetoes these bills, then what? Then we start over. If she vetoes the bill that takes her money away and it is still tie-barred to the budget doesn't get signed either, and we have to keep fighting to get that done. So there's a lot of concern around these. I do think it's the first shot. I don't know that this is going to be the final thing they do. It's a rough way to start the year, but here we are. So yes, if she vetoes, then the money doesn't flow and we wait and we have to pass another one. The legislature's proposal will be outlined in news from the Capitol today, yes. Recommendations for districts to get educators back when the vaccine is not readily available. This, I bet some of you have better recommendations than I do. I know that the vaccine rollout is very dependent on your health departments, that some health departments are easier to work with than other health departments. But getting those educators back in their classroom is a conversation for your locals. I don't have good recommendations because I don't know your specific situation. So I don't know if there are people that have ideas. If you could throw those in the chat for Yvette, that would be great. What should our local advocacy priority be to legislators in terms of this budget and relief money? I think right now, today, with the news that is out there, it has to be that schools should not be held hostage. The federal government has appropriated this money and it needs to be given to the schools where it belongs. I think that that is the message that needs to be out there that legislators need to hear. It shouldn't have anything to do with the governor's powers because this is not governor money. This is Fed money. And it was passed last year in December. It should be flowing to our state at any point, and we need to make that flow into the districts. And so I think that is the message, is that we need to release this federal money to the districts as the federal government has said it should be done, and not hold it up while we argue about other political pieces of the COVID recovery. The district would not allow families to choose. You had to choose by semester to be virtual or face-to-face. I know there are a lot of districts that are doing that for planning purposes. I wouldn't worry too much about that at this point. We don't know if that's how this is going to be signed. That's the other problem with the date in the bill, is we don't know that this will even pass by February 15th for schools to be in place in February 15th. So that's going to be a moving target. It's definitely something to think about, but I wouldn't stress too much about it at this point until we get a better idea. We don't know how the Senate's going to react to this yet. We don't know how the full House is going to react to this yet. This was dropped and heard to grab some press on State of the State Day. I do not think the Senate or the House can override a veto, nor do I think that Majority Leader Shirkey or Speaker Wentworth would even allow that to happen. I don't think they would bring it up. The grants for educators that were discussed in the State of the State are the same ones that came out of the budget last year. They're just finally getting distributed, and they will be distributed in February. The new grants that I mentioned are in the House proposal for teachers and staff for summer school. And so those don't exist yet. They're proposed, but the ones that she mentioned in State of the State was just calling back attention to the fact that we did that program and that the money will start flowing to staff in February. Are there any other questions about that before we move into our priorities? I don't know if who they will include in that grant. All I have is their summary, and it just said, no, actually it says K-8 in the summary. So that would be a no to preschoolers. But again, that's as it's proposed, as it sits in House Appropriations right now. So we'll move on to our priorities so that we can squeeze those in. If you have questions, continue to put them in the chat. If we don't get to them all, we will try to address them in News from the Capitol or with you one-on-one. And if you have questions that come up after this, feel free to email any one of us with those questions and we will track down answers for you. So we have brand new priorities for this session. Hopefully all or many of you participated in that priority setting process. We held 10 meetings virtually to brainstorm with members and superintendents to hear what they want to see as priorities for MASB going forward. We took every single idea from those priorities and put it into a survey sent out to all of you and asked you to pick your top 3 in 5 different topics. We then took what rose to the top of that survey to our Government Relations Committee. They whittled it down to 8. And by combining some, we looked forward as a 2-year process. So the things that are in these priorities aren't pandemic specific. They may have been exacerbated by the pandemic, but they're not pandemic specific. The other thing to keep in mind, because we didn't include pandemic specific priorities, is that it doesn't mean we're not working on those. These are just the priorities that we've put together to work toward in the next 2 years. And our board of directors adopted those in the middle of January, and I'm going to have Jeff go through them for you.
Yeah, so we have 8 priorities, and the number one priority, well, it's not really in rank and order, but the top of the sheet, it's to increase mental health services and professionals in schools and provide adequate state resources to allow schools to educate, provide social emotional supports, and keep students safe. It seems like mental health just seems like a huge issue for students and staff. It was an issue that came up at every meeting we had this fall. The next one on the list is expanding access to quality internet and proper devices for all students and staff. Again, this is just an issue that has really exploded with the pandemic, but even without the pandemic, it's still important for students to have access at home to be able to do homework, even if they're in school during the day. And so this is a big issue for us, and we'll really focus on this over the next 2 years. Review and implement recommendations of the School Finance Research Collaborative to move toward more equitable funding for students. This was in the governor's budget proposal a year ago, sort of a weighted formula to take into account the cost for each student. And so we will support that approach. Protect the school aid fund and local revenues from state tax policy changes. As you're aware, there's a lot of legislation out there that sort of feel-good tax cuts, but it does impact the money that goes to our schools, and so we will fight to protect that revenue. Support proper funding for third grade reading intervention tools and remove the mandatory retention. So we'll be working on that. Universal preschool for all 4-year-old children. That is a carryover from our previous priorities. Specify that the state school aid fund is only for pre-K to 12th grade public education, so that it would not go to fund community colleges or higher ed. And then also oppose any attempts to create a private school voucher or tax credit program. And then the last priority is to look at implementing state-based programs to address teacher shortages and retain teachers. And this has only been exacerbated by the pandemic, and getting high quality teachers into the classroom and getting them to stay is a big priority for us. So I would be happy to answer any questions about our priorities. It looks like we have a question about mental health. It says, in terms of mental health, the constant pivot and uncertainty is really hurting our students and staff. Yeah, we agree. It'd be nice if we could have certainty and predictability for students and for families, and just, parents who are, constantly asked to change their schedules around and to do things for their kids. So yes, that is a big issue. And I think that definitely falls into the mental health category. And then a question about, are most of the funding issues covered in the School Finance Research Collaborative? Should the report be the focus when discussing funding with legislators? Yeah, I think that's a good thing, a good place to start. I mean, the collaborative has broad support, and it really recognizes the actual costs that go into educating kids and the difference in terms of educating kids who may be, at risk or English learners or special ed. And I think that really needs to be communicated to the legislature. So yeah, that would be a great place to start. What ideas are being considered to increase participation in teacher education programs? Tuition assistance for choosing education. Yeah, I think that would be one thing that could go along with that. I know that the Department of Education just released some grants to local districts to do sort of a grow your own program, try to recruit students, sort of the I think they call it teacher cadet programs. And so I think that's one way to do it. And we're definitely open to working with, anybody who has good ideas in terms of recruiting. I mean, but yes, I do think any kind of tuition assistance would probably encourage people to go into teaching. And then with the recent Mega Millions winner,
I'll address that one, Jeff.
Yeah. Okay.
So the recent Mega Millions winner, we actually were talking about this, and where the money will go to SAF is that person just received $32 million in income. And so there's going to be a boost to that income that is taken. The money, the winnings does not go directly to the school aid fund. What the lottery sales go directly to the school aid fund. The winnings go to the winners. But we will see an uptick, and the state will see an uptick because that $32 million was awarded in Michigan. So the question is how it's going to work, and I don't have the answers to that. But this is a conversation we've been having since we saw they won in Michigan. We're like, we haven't really seen this before, but $32 million is a lot that's going to be taxed. And so the taxes that are withheld from that are what are going to flow to the school aid fund as well as the general fund. And having never really dealt with a pot this big, I can't tell you how that's going to be distributed, but it will be a benefit to us that our winner was in Michigan. Has there been talk about working towards overhauling the school aid funding system we currently have? I think that some of that is SFRC and those baby steps to get to a weighted formula. But I also know that the Launch Michigan organization has been looking into this as well. And so they are looking at education funding on a long-term basis to try to come up with how do we do this better and how do we do it right. So this is a conversation that comes up all the time. And one of the questions I'm asked is, what will it take to get proposal aid changed? And part of our problem is term limits. Proposal aid is a huge lift. And legislators have 6 years in the House and 8 years in the Senate to do what they want to do. And in order to get a proposal aid type program put together by the legislators and their staff and legislative staff, you would need someone who would dedicate their term to it. And you find people who are passionate about it, but not so much that they want to leave in 6 years and have one bill to their name. They want to show they did something while they were here. And so we run into that problem that there is passion and there is desire, but the legislators then look back at us and say, well, give us something. So the work isn't being done by the legislature really because they don't have that time to dedicate to it. They want to be able to make a difference for their districts in the short time they have. And overhauling Prop A may make a difference to their districts, but it may take 10 years to do. So we run into some of that when we have these meetings too, but they're definitely, the SFRC has helped push in that direction. And I think that if Launch can be successful in getting the schools and businesses and philanthropics to really dig into this, I think that we could come up with something that if we can write it, we can hand it to someone, but that's the big problem. Yes, these legislative, that was Chandra telling her she can share. Yes, you can share these, excuse me, these legislative priorities with your legislators. There's a link in last week's News from the Capitol. We'll have another link in this week. You can find it on our website. You can find it on our eVicit site. We try to put it out there more than you could ever need it, but please do share them. We will be doing that as we start our meet and greets. Jeff and I are already making appointments with all of the members of the education committees in both chambers, the K-12 committees, and then those other committees that we touch on, like workforce and tax policy, finance in the Senate, local government sometimes because they deal with property tax issues. So we're figuring out who all we need to meet with, and we're going to start spending a lot of time on Zoom with these people. We have seen concern about the title formula distribution of the COVID relief. We have actually are working with MASA and then our national counterparts. So the National Association of Superintendents and Administrators and the National Association of School Board Members, School Board Associations, to say that the Title 1A distribution formula, while it does affect equity, is very, very disparate. So for example, the district I live in is going to get $75 per student, whereas Flint City is going to get $13,000 per student. And there are some districts that aren't getting any. So we have asked in the first request to our Congress people is we can keep the Title 1A formula, but when we're putting out $1.6 billion, maybe we don't put 90% of it through Title 1A. Maybe we have part of it through Title 1A and part of it through a per pupil so that we can address the equity issues, but also address the idea that it's not just districts with high at-risk students that are dealing with extra costs from the pandemic. Nothing happened with that last time. The train was sort of running really fast, but we're trying to start that conversation now at the federal level where we can support our federal organizations. I've actually reached out to the MEs from around the country too to ask them if they are seeing that issue. And at least 3 of them had responded very quickly to say, yes, they're hearing the same thing and they would like to see a slightly different formula too. But we don't want to go so far as that we're not doing it on an equity basis and not addressing the at-risk students and their issues with the pandemic. But we do think that there might be a more equitable way to do it. Mark, is your question a drawback of term limits? Is that like all of my thoughts? Because that's going to take a really long time. Are there any other questions with our priorities or the legislature, or really just anything else that you're facing out there that we might be able to answer for you in our last like 5 or so minutes? All right. Well, if you think of things, let us know. You can reach us directly through our emails or through masb.gov@masb.org. We're happy to answer any of your questions. We are working remotely, but all of our phones go right to our cell phones, so you'll reach us. We will have this recorded and available for your viewing pleasure or those that were not able to make it next week. And we do expect the next pandemic order to probably come out mid-February, since this one runs until February 21st. In the meantime, we will keep you posted if anything changes on sports or in-person meetings, which seem to be the 2 big things we're hearing about. And if you have any other issues that come up or things that you think need to be addressed, please don't believe it's just your district and you don't want to bother us, because I don't think we've gotten a single thing that has been just one district. So feel free to reach out, and I will put a plug in for Brad Banasic as well, our legal counsel, if you've got questions about how to meet or about the meetings or really anything else. He is always available as well. We've taken a lot of phone calls these last few months. So anything we can do to help, we're always here. So thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.